Hi, good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming. Thank you for our hosts and organizers. As Ayelet said, my name is Smadar Ben-Natan. I teach here at the University of Washington courses relating to law and religion in Israel, human and civil rights. I'm an Israeli lawyer, and I came to the United States about 7 years ago. I was asked to give you a short background and summary on what is happening in this Israeli government's attack on democratic institutions. It is very hard to do that in 5 minutes. It is very hard because such historic and constitutive moments are always a combination of many processes and many interest groups and ideologies that are pushing together and that ultimately coalesce. And I'm going to try to break it up a little bit. But I just want to say that if you do want to have a longer conversation, a longer talk, or a conversation in your congregation, in your living room, in your neighborhood, I welcome that, and I'm happy to participate. This evening I will address I have 4 subtitles, so headings. What has the Israeli government's attack on democratic institutions comprised of, where this process currently stands, and where it is possibly heading, and I'll give you just some examples of what had happened. What are the underlying problems in Israel's government system and legal system that created the conditions for this crisis? What are the underlying agendas and ideologies that are behind this government coup, and why should American Jews care? And what can your voice mean? The moves of the Israeli government follow the footsteps of the rise of autocratic regimes around the world, like in Hungary and in Poland. This provides us academics, with a lot of knowledge that enables political scientists and legal scholars to analyze the situation, and it actually has been termed the Hungarian protocol that the Israeli government is following, and the Israeli academic community has really put a lot of forces into explaining what is happening to the general public, and I'm part of that, and I'm using that. It also follows the presidency of Donald Trump in the United States, who still presents similar threats to the US system and has bolstered the Israeli far right. And all of these mean that this is not just an innocent judicial reform. This is a coup, this is an attack on Israeli democratic institutions on full scale. So first of all, I want to address the anti-democratic legislation. The main aspect of it is to impede and dismantle the power and the independence of the Israeli judicial system, which is the only check on the power of the government, and thereby the government seeks to gain unlimited powers. The Israeli government announcement this January on a legal reform or judicial reform was followed by a huge wave of 225, and it grows by the day, anti-democratic legislative proposals that I'm going to just touch on a few of this. It is crucial because the first stage is to remove legal barriers and checks, and then that enables the government to pursue a host of other more direct repressive moves against basic civil rights and human rights, and dismantle other democratic institutions like higher education, like civil society, like the press, that are the watchdogs of democracy. So the Forum of Israeli Political Scientists analyzed these over 200 legislation proposals and divided them into several categories. So first of all, there are direct proposals targeting the judicial system and the Supreme Court, the first of which has passed this July to not allow the Supreme Court to use the reasonableness doctrine in order to review the acts of the government. Other planned changes are to change the composition of the committee that appoints judges. So far, that committee was comprised of a minority of politicians from both sides of the aisle and a majority of professionals, of judges and of lawyers. And they are trying to give the politicians control over the committee, not only the politicians, but those from the side of the government. So the appointment of judges is under threat, and the system by which the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is appointed is also under threat. Now it's a system of seniority, and they want to, again, replace it with a system where politicians control the judicial system. Other aspects that follow this main aspect, as the Israeli political scientists analyzed it, first of all, violating human and civil rights. One example of that is violating the activities and the funding of human rights and civil society organizations. The second one is enforcing orthodox religious rules on the general public. One example of that is extending the jurisdiction of rabbinical courts, who now have the exclusive jurisdiction over divorce and marriage. They want to give them further jurisdiction over civilian matters. These courts, because they use orthodox rules, consistently discriminate against women, as one example. And this is why this is a threat to civil and human rights of women in Israel and of other groups. The third element is hampering the election systems. So there are bills aimed at limiting access to voting in several ways and canceling the judicial review of the Supreme Court over disqualifying political parties. So the right is consistently in Israel disqualifying political parties of Arab citizens of Israel, and the Supreme Court always then reviews it and in most cases allows it, and they want to cancel that, so effectively block the ways of Arab Israeli representation in the Knesset. The next one is politicizing the civil service and allowing corruption. Next is overtaking public media. Next is limiting freedom of education and harming universities, the independence of universities, and political activities on university campuses. And last is transferring, and this has already been done because it did not require legislation, but was administrative changes that transferred all the powers over the occupied territories, the West Bank, and the settlements from the military command to the far-right minister governments. The government then, after over 55 years that the military was managing as a more disconnected from politics body, was managing what is happening in the West Bank. Now it is directly managed by Israeli ministers, by the Israeli government, and used to transfer funding and other assistance to the settlements and harshen the attitudes towards Palestinians. And we've seen several incidents of violence against Palestinians that were actively supported by ministers. So that administrative change moved the authorities from the military to government ministers. Other bills that are soon to come are the exemption of yeshiva students from military service, an issue that is really central to Israeli politics, and a law, the basic law, Limud Torah, which equates the study of the Torah to other substantive service to the country, meaning to give yeshiva students all the benefits or many of the benefits that soldiers or veterans enjoy. And there are many other steps that are taken as a matter of policy, like withholding funding from Arab students in East Jerusalem, like not transferring money to Arab municipalities, and like conducting prayers, as we've seen in just this Yom Kippur, that segregate women and men in public spaces. And the Supreme Court, again, was asked to decide and decided that public spaces should not be segregated to men and women. So we see that many groups that are minority groups are being threatened by this wholesale change in the principles of government. Some underlying problems that enable that, or that create the conditions for that, is that Israel has no solid constitution that limits government powers and protects civil rights. There's a very weak, and you've already alluded to, very weak system of checks and balances. The judiciary is the only limitation on government power. The legislature and the government are essentially one body, and they're not the same body, but the government has always complete control over the legislature. The Supreme Court is the institution that created a judicial bill of rights, and that was the single institution to protect those rights, especially of vulnerable groups like religious minorities, including reform and conservative communities, the LGBTQ communities, women, children, migrants, national minorities, people living in poverty, the press, and so on. The third underlying issue is that Israel does not have a separation of state and religion, or church and state, like you call it in the US. Jewish religion has the status of a state religion, but the problematics with that is that one single interpretation of religion is backed by government power. And historically, there was an agreement on Orthodox monopoly over an Orthodox religious establishment over the matters of religion, including marriage and divorce, public worship and holy places, and the exemption of yeshiva students from the military. So these are the three underlying problems. Now, as I said, the dismantling of the judicial system is opening the door to several ideological, political, and sectorial agendas that are at work here. And I think that with the examples, you can already understand what they are. The first one is corruption. The Prime Minister is standing trial on corruption charges, and other ministers are also implicated, and they seek to have a system where they don't need to answer for any appointments that they do to answer by any professional standards or reasonable standards. And the reasonable doctrine in particular was a way to review appointments on the government, and the dismantling of this doctrine is specific for government actions. So every other body is still subject to reasonableness except the government. So this was a clear step to bolster government power. The second agenda is against democracy and civil rights. So it's a conservative, autocratic agenda that seeks to roll back democratic institutions. And the third one is the promotion of and the deepening of the occupation and settlements, cementing the undemocratic and worsening the oppression of Palestinians who are denied both civil and human rights. The guidelines of the government state that the government seeks to apply Israeli sovereignty over the territories, so promote annexation of the West Bank, and this is part of what they are trying to do. On both of these three issues, the Supreme Court was the only institution that blocked these agendas. I'm finishing up. Why and how you should take a position. The experiment of a modern Jewish state is unprecedented in Jewish history, you know that. And I think Jewish history could teach us some lessons on standing for justice, equality, and human rights. You have power and responsibility as one of the main supporters of Israel. Since the American Jewish community is pluralistic and comprised of multiple non-Orthodox streams, protections of religious freedoms directly affect the recognition of non-Orthodox individuals and communities, like conversions, like marriages, burials, and other religious rituals. Israel is the center of Jewish life, And whether we like it or not, it reflects on how Jews are seen around the world in the non-Jewish world. It is important that American Jews protect their own rights as a religious minority, and it is important to keep this principle of protecting religious minorities, not only for Jews, but also when Jews are in the majority and other minorities, other religions are the minority. And similarly, annexation and segregation will make Israel an international pariah, and we may reach a situation that instead of protecting Jews, Israel will be putting them under threat. The Jewish community here has flourished with the separation of church and state, and you know from your experience how important it is to protect religious minorities. You have a unique voice where you can say, we will not support Israel uncritically. This coup will create a rift between the Jewish community in the diaspora and the state of Israel, and that Jewish life can be richer, diverse, and inclusive without being backed by state power, without Jewish supremacist agendas and the oppression of others. Thank you.